As I think some of you know, I'm Peter Knox. I'm the director of the Baker-Nord Center, and we're delighted to be sponsoring the third in the new series of Strauss lectures, and welcoming here from Columbia University our guest, Professor Elisabeth Ladenson. On Monday, she laid the groundwork on her for us with her discussions of the death and possible life of the author. And this evening, she's going to give us a test case. She'll be speaking with the intriguing title of Colette at the Gas Station, the woman author. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I would like to thank once again everyone who, what on earth is this? Okay, I don't know. Anyway, so thank you very much, Peter. And I would like to take, again, the opportunity of thanking all of the people who have made my stay thus far so tremendously pleasant and convivial. And I won't attempt to list all of their names because there are too many of them. But I would particularly like to thank once again Maggie Kaminsky, who has really been tremendously helpful in every way, and Christine Cano, who has been tremendously helpful in other ways. So on Monday. I don't have any idea of what kind of overlap there is. And there, one person, okay. Hi. But anyway, this should be comprehensible. There will be some echoes of Monday and some anticipations of Friday, but I think all of this should be entirely comprehensible on its own ground. So this is called Colette at the Gas Station for reasons that will become clear in just a second. And I should add that, as you will be able to see, since I've called this whole thing The Author in the Margins, I've thought that it would be nice to peep out from the margins myself in the text. So each of these talks begins with a little autobiographical gesture. I first encountered Colette at a gas station in 1971. Touring Europe with my parents, I was 10 years old and experiencing life from the backseat of a Renault 15, a sporty green vehicle my father had bought with the quixotic intention of bringing it back to New York. And I will just add that that car became the bane of everyone's existence as it broke down constantly. No one could possibly fix it. He had to find someone to, anyway, it ended up, it was not a good idea. But it was a pleasant memory for me. That summer, Elf, the charmingly named chain of French service stations, was giving away a paperback with each full tank of gas. Being at once an avid reader and an ardent fan of gas station giveaways like the Put a Tiger in Your Tank glasses Essa was offering back home around the same time, I was thrilled. We were given, or maybe my parents chose, Gigi. Now, I think it must have been, it was like a classic novel giveaway. I still have the volume, and I still have the volume. I've taught with it, which was a kind of a weird experience. Anyway, none of us could read the thing. Frustratingly, it was in French, but that meant that I got to keep it. Since I couldn't read the book itself, I studied the cover, which featured a black and white photograph of a teenage girl wearing a plaid skirt, a white blouse, and a big poofy tie, curled up in an armchair with a melancholy air. It was, in fact, it was a still from the Jacqueline Audry film version from 1947. I later realized that film. I mean, Gigi is probably still best known for the over-the-top Hollywood Vincent Minnelli musical version from about 10 years after that, from 1958, I think, and that film was actually based on the Jacqueline Audry film rather than being directly based on the novella, but in any case. So the Gigi on the cover of this book appeared to be sucking her thumb or possibly gnawing at it. I found this image disturbing and by the same token intriguing. What could possibly explain it? The picture bore some perverse relation to childhood that I couldn't fathom. It seemed inappropriately infantile and inappropriately sexual all at once. It appeared to be somehow about me and at the same time clearly not meant for me. This made little sense at the time. I hadn't yet seen Baby Doll, didn't know about Lolita. Gigi became an object of great fascination to me, therefore for these reasons, long before I was able to read it. It turns out you can judge a book by its cover, after all. Years later, when I actually read the novella, I was surprised to discover that my inchoate childhood response had been accurate. Gigi is all about the point where the inappropriately infantile meets the inappropriately sexual. I also learned that this theme had launched Colette's career. Her first book, Claudine à l'école, Claudine at School, published in 1900, had been written, commissioned really, with much the same effect in mind. In this novel, the first of a series, written at the behest of her first husband and initially published under his name, Colette had perfected the wildly successful formula of the diary of a young girl, but not for young girls, as the putative author known as Willy put it in his preface. He further maintained that the novel was a barely edited version of a diary sent to him, tied in a pink ribbon, by a young girl from the provinces. The publisher initially objected to inclusion of this preface, observing that it would make readers think he hadn't written the book himself, as indeed he hadn't. But Willy, a canny entrepreneur, if ever there was one, was betting on his readers interpreting the announcement that he had merely edited the text, which again was in fact the case, to mean that he was in fact really its author. In order to ensure this, he stuffed the preface with allusions to the lengthy European tradition of pornographic and semi-pornographic works written by men for men about female sexuality, or rather, male fantasies about female sexuality. He was betting that readers would know that such works were always presented as straight from the horse's mouth, written by young women, with the actual male author presenting himself as editor, or else eclipsing himself entirely. As a result, his audience would understand Willy's announcement that he hadn't written the work he had signed to be a veiled indication that he was, in fact, its author. Claudine at School was a huge bestseller in 1900 and for many years thereafter, and indeed it has sold well for over a century and has never been out of print in France. In the years immediately following its initial publication, it spawned not only a series of Claudine adventures, signed Willy and written by Colette to order, more or less to order, but also theatrical adaptations and a remarkable array of Claudine products, including Claudine clothing lines, makeup, perfume, lotions, hats, ice cream, cigarettes, toothpicks, and even, bizarrely enough, photographic paper. This photography was... as a hobby was a big deal at the time. This fantastically successful publicity gambit has even left a permanent mark on French fashion in the form of what is still, more than a century later, referred to as a Claudine collar, the girlish rounded collar called Peter Pan in English, and that both the names come from around the same time. If McDonald's had existed at the time, you can be sure there would have been Claudine-themed Happy Meals. Colette's first husband was a marketing genius, and it's tempting to say that he was ahead of his time, except that in fact he was squarely of his time, the age, for instance, of P.T. Barnum. And yet, while Willy signed the books and arranged for the product placements, there were also inkwells shaped like his signature bespoke flat-brimmed top hat. Colette is the one whose reputation has endured. It didn't take long before people began to suspect that it was not he, but his young provincial wife, who was the real author of the Claudine series. When she married him at 20, she was Sidonie Gabrielle Colette, known as Gabrielle or Gabri. Colette was her last name, her father's name, but it was also at the same time a girl's name, and thus offered itself as a handy single moniker. Willy's real name was Henri Gauthier Villard. He published under a variety of pen names, Willy being the one that stuck. Later in life, she always referred to him publicly, long after they'd divorced, as Monsieur Willy. In fact, also after he died in 1931, she always referred to him publicly as Monsieur Willy, just as she had officially become Madame Colette. But that was much later. She moved to Paris with him the day after they were married in May 1893, and the next year she was signing letters Colette Willy. Colette Willy, as though Colette were a first name and Willy were a last name, but in fact neither was the case. Her new husband was famous as man about town, music critic, and author of light novels notoriously written by a stable of ghostwriters. He was an extremely adept literary entrepreneur. Even before they were divorced and she officially reclaimed authorship of the Claudine series in 1907, she was already known as a writer in her own right. In 1905, she had published Dialogue de Bêtes under the byline Colette Willy and as the principal author of Claudine. And yet, for years after they'd parted ways, both literarily and personally, her books were all still appearing under the bet-hedging signature, it's very weird, Colette, and then in parentheses, Colette Willy. So that was how all the books were signed until 1923, by which point she was one of France's most famous writers, and Willy was best known as her ex-husband. Finally then, in 1923, she signed a book, the scandalous novel Le Blé en Herbe, under the sole name Colette. Le Blé en Herbe has been translated a whole bunch of times under different titles: The Ripening Wheat, The Ripening Green Wheat. There are probably other ones as well. In fact, the last translation is, in fact, dates from just a few years ago. She's extremely hard to translate, I can tell you from personal failure experience. Claudine at school is hardly pornographic. From the perspective of our 21st century twerk-heavy culture, it may be as difficult to see why it caused such a stir as to understand why Madame Bovary or Ulysses were viewed as obscene when they were first published. Many of Colette's works were viewed as unseemly, most often for their depictions of adolescent sexuality. In 1923, the serial publication of Le Blé en Herbe was cut short abruptly when its 16-and-a-half-year-old protagonist, having been deflowered by an older woman, seemed to be on the verge of doing the same for his 15-and-a-half-year-old girlfriend, 15-and-a-half being the same age as Claudine and Gigi and pretty much every single other hero or heroine of coming-of-age novels, it seems to me. Including, might I add, Raymond Radiguet's The Devil in the Flesh, The Diable au Corps, and Herman Raucher's 1971 Summer of 42. They're all 15-and-a-half, boys and girls. When the novel first appeared, when Le Blé en Herbe first appeared in translation, in English translation, 1932, under the title The Ripening, a New York Times reviewer unwittingly echoed Willy's presentation of Claudine à l'école, observing that while it was, quote, a book about adolescence, The Ripening is certainly not for adolescent reading, close quote. In keeping with the phenomenon we might call sic transit ignominium mundi, in which scandalous works eventually become quaintly tame, there are now school textbook editions of both Claudine à l'école and Le Blé en Herbe in France, complete with vocabulary notes and explanatory essays to help students understand what had been deemed highly inappropriate for previous generations of young people and kept rigorously out of their grasp. In 1900, Claudine's boisterous stories of schoolgirl homoeroticism were greeted as both risque and innovative. Because it was signed by a man, what's more, a man known for writing, or at least publishing, ribald fiction, the novel was read as the latest entry in the centuries-old tradition of softcore and also hardcore narratives written by men from the point of view of young women, the most infamous example in English being John Cleland's mid-18th century Fanny Hill, or Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, as it's officially called. Willy was cannily playing on this sort of precedent when he wrote his preface claiming to have received the manuscript in the mail. If Claudine at school had been published not under his name but that of its actual author, it would of created an unimaginably greater scandal, but by that same token, such a publication would have been unthinkable. And in fact, about 50 years later, someone named Dorothy Busey wrote a novel called Olivia, which is a much less explicitly sexual story of schoolgirl homoeroticism, published anonymously, or rather pseudonymously, under the byline Olivia, in other words, the same name as that of the protagonist. And it was published in both England and France. The author's name was simply given as Olivia. And Busey's novel, which in many ways reads like a tragic variation on Claudine à l'école, also shares with the latter the dubious distinction of having sat in a drawer for some time because the man to whom it was first shown deemed it to be without interest. Colette recounts in her 1936 memoir of the Willy years, called Mes Apprentissages, My Apprenticeships, that when she had obediently filled several notebooks with what was to become Claudine à l'école, Claudine at school, Willy's first reaction upon reading the contents was to say that he'd been wrong, that there was nothing he could use. In Olivia's case, the lapse between writing and publication was 16 years rather than 1 or 2, and the man in question was André Gide. It wasn't until Busey showed her manuscript to some of her Bloomsbury friends that she gained the courage to try to publish Olivia, which came out in 1949. Colette, too, had taken no for an answer, according to her memoir. Claudine à l'école didn't see publication until Willy stumbled on the notebooks while cleaning out a drawer, took a second look, and declaring that he'd been an ass, went straight off to see his publisher, and the rest was history. In 1900, the erotic exploits of Claudine were scandalous as written by a man. It was out of the question for the same book to have been written by a woman. Nonetheless, it was obvious that Willy's young provincial wife had provided the inspiration for the novel, and from the start, some readers suspected her of being its true author as well. Colette wrote it for Willy in at least 2 senses, at his request and in his name. She always maintained that she never would have written it or anything else without his insistence. She also claimed that it was he who ordered her to spice up her memories of her school days, and there's no reason not to believe her, that is to say, to put a lot of homoeroticism into it. Willy loved innuendo, and he loved creating a scandal. The publication of Claudine at school and its aftermath marked the high point of his career. He liked to call himself le père de Claudine, the father of Claudine, and to parade his young wife around Paris with Pollard, the actress who played Claudine on the stage, the 2 young women identically dressed as twins, and the whole spectacle designed to suggest an incestuous ménage à trois. Biographers differ on the question of whether Pollard was really sleeping with Willy or Colette, or both or neither, as all of these possibilities have been claimed, and at least until someone invents a time travel machine, we'll never know. Even so, it would be difficult to ascertain, but if anyone ever does invent such a machine, I plan to be first in line to volunteer for that particular fact-finding mission. Given that Colette's post-Willy shenanigans included creating a near riot in 1907 by flaunting her relationship with Mathilde de Morny, the Marquise de Belleboeuf, known as Missy, although a more accurate nickname would have been Butch, on the stage of the Moulin Rouge, her retrospective reticence on the subject of schoolgirl crushes might appear to be a bit misplaced. But then Colette always, in her autobiographical writings, depicted her childhood and adolescence in Saint-Sauveur-en-Puisay in Burgundy as an Edenic, prelapsarian, sexuality-free idyll. How do you pronounce that? Idyllic thing. In any case, she consistently rewrote her story according to the demands of the moment. Alongside her immense talents as a writer, she also owed her astonishing career to a capacity for protean self-reinvention and adroit self-promotion, which must have been, at least in part, learned from Willy. During her first 5 years as a writer, between 1900 and 1905, she published 4 Claudine books, 2 other novels also signed by Willy, Mine and des Égarements de Mine, later published together under her own name under the title L'Ingénue Libertine, and separately under the byline Colette Willy in 1904, a series of charming and witty and also quite pointed dialogues between her dog and her cat, Dialogue de Bête. And then there was another expanded edition. It was very popular. Over the course of a half century, her last book, an eclectic memoir called The Blue Lantern, Le Fanal Bleu, appeared in 1949. She earned her living as ghostwriter, dancer, actress, journalist, editor, public speaker, playwright, screenwriter, and briefly cosmetics entrepreneur, all the while churning out novel stories and memoirs and journalism that were at once popular and well-regarded. And essay collections. In 1910, with La Vagabonde, she became one of France's most respected as well as best-known writers. The publication of Chérie in 1920, which marked her first complete departure from the autobiographical Claudine-inflected model that had launched her career and ensured her success, earned her adulatory articles in the preeminent Nouvelle Revue Française, among other periodicals, which meant acceptance among the prominent male French authors of the era, Proust and Gide and Mauriac and people like that. By the early 30s, almost all her books were translated into English as well as other languages and regularly reviewed in major newspapers all over the world. She was and remains by far the best-known French woman writer of the first half of the 20th century. And in fact, if you look at histories of French women authors, for instance, if you look at histories of French literature, she's the only woman author usually mentioned in the first half of the 20th century, which is very strange. But so a bit more on that later. Her self-transformations were social as well as professional. Having started out as the youngest daughter of an eccentric clan in Burgundy, whose eccentricities included not being native to the area, she was propelled into the Parisian literary and social world when she married Willy. Following their very public divorce, she gained exponentially increased notoriety by launching a career as a music hall performer, known for dancing semi-naked on the stage. And even if you didn't dance semi-naked on the stage, being a music hall performer was very close to being a prostitute. I mean, in the absence of other information. Refusing to wear the flesh-colored body stockings then standard on stage as a way of suggesting nudity while avoiding the display of actual flesh. Her left breast, bared nightly in a wildly successful mime play called La Chair, Flesh, in 1908, became famous on its own right. She was not, it seems, all that, and in fact, Maurice Chevalier, in one of his many volumes of memoirs, has like a paragraph devoted to its many splendors. She was not, it seems, all that talented as an actress or dancer, although she was an accomplished mime trained by Georges Vague, one of the foremost practitioners and teachers of the art of pantomime, which was then undergoing a huge revival. Her charisma and apparent shamelessness or willingness to brave public disapproval, coupled with an athletic build, iron self-discipline, boundless energy, and a keen eye for publicity, made her performance career a great success. And of course, it didn't hurt that she was already notorious for the Claudine novels and her highly visible marriage and divorce. She was publicly forthright about her relationship with Missy, at one point writing an open letter to a newspaper insisting that they should be regarded as a couple like any other. In fact, she had gone off on vacation with Willy and his new girlfriend. The four of them had gone off together, and someone had made some sort of slanderous suggestion about a ménage à quatre, and so she wrote this letter to the newspaper. But then it also helped that her lover was an aristocrat, a niece of Napoleon III on her father's side, and a Russian aristocrat on her mother's side. It's hard to imagine that Colette would have been as willing to flout public opprobrium if she'd taken up for the chambermaid, for instance. The open letter takes visible pleasure in referring to La Marquise et moi. Her performance career didn't come to an end until 1912, when she became pregnant by and subsequently married Henri de Jouvenel, who was himself an aristocrat, although from a less glorious lineage than Missy's, as well as being the director of a major newspaper, Le Matin. one of the three major newspapers at the time. She became Baronne de Jouvenel and literary editor of Le Matin. This marriage lasted some 10 years and brought her a huge measure of social ascendance, although by the same token, her past notoriety hampered her husband's political ambitions to a great degree. The marriage was brought to an end by her husband's serial womanizing. In this, he resembled Willy and lots of other men at the time, and also by her own affair with his young son, Bertrand de Jouvenel, who was, how many years younger? He was much younger than, he was like 30 years younger than her. Irreconcilable differences, apparently. Her third marriage was to Maurice Goudquet, a Jewish pearl merchant 16 years her junior. When he was taken by the Gestapo during the war, she had to call in favors from occupation contacts to get him out of an internment camp. In short, hers was a remarkably eventful life. When she died in 1954, she was given a state funeral by the French government, but was refused a religious ceremony by the Catholic Church because of her divorces and scandalous career, and also because she was not, in fact, a believing or practicing Catholic. The Catholic English author Graham Greene published an open letter of protest, but to no avail. And again, since she wasn't really a practicing Catholic, it seemed sort of appropriate that the church didn't want to give her a church funeral. But anyway, so Colette is a unique figure in any number of ways. She is, for instance, surely the only author to have inspired both a biopic combining a feminist inspirational tale and softcore pornography, Becoming Colette, dating from 1991, and a country western song, Rosanne Cash's The Summer I Read Colette, from 1996. It's not just her action-packed life that prompts these homages. It apparently wasn't action-packed enough for the makers of Becoming Colette, who simply invented scenes and indeed people to fit their improbable hybrid genre, but also the enduring nature of her prose. Certainly it's hard to imagine Rosanne Cash singing about the summer she read Sartre or Proust. Colette inspired this homage both because of the nature of her subject matter, women's lives, and her colorful and unflinching approach to telling the stories she told. If she hadn't been a great writer, she would still have been a colorful figure of the Belle Époque, but that's all she would have been for posterity. Her early hijinks are still memorable, mainly because she went on to become France's great woman writer of the first half of the 20th century. She may have started out as a music hall provocatrice, but she also wrote about her experiences as a performer, becoming the chronicler of the music hall scene as well as one of its most famous artists. Everything was grist for her mill. The writerly omnivorousness doesn't in itself explain her preeminent place in French literature, but it is a key aspect of her career. Some 40 years after baring her left breast on the stage, she was elected president of France's most prestigious literary institution, the Académie Goncourt. No one else before or since has managed to pull off quite such a coup. It's as though Lady Gaga were to cap off her career with a Nobel Prize. How did she do it? Clearly, it took a combination of talent, keen intelligence, and great effrontery, or shamelessness, if you prefer, with, of course, a measure of sheer luck. If Willy hadn't come along, for instance, perhaps someone equally auspicious would have, but then again, perhaps not. And if we are to believe her, she never would have started writing without being pushed into it by Willy. What's especially remarkable is that while there were many other women writers publishing novels in France at the same time as Colette, some of them hugely popular, she is effectively the only one from that era who's still read. Whereas Britain and America were full of prominent women writers from the first half of the 20th century, during the first half of the 20th century, authors who were at once popular and taken seriously, Eudora Welty, Rebecca West, Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, to mention only the W's. I can't explain why I produced a list of authors whose names begin with W, but that was what came to mind. The same, however, cannot be said for France. Of course, very few names begin with W in France, but except for Willy, I guess. But no, even if you go beyond the W's in the alphabet, you don't see the same thing. In France, these same writers, Eudora Welty, Rebecca West, Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, etc., were published and read in translation. It was not simply that the French had no interest in women writers per se, but the history of women in French literature generally skips straight from George Sand in the 19th century, born in 1804, died in 1876, to Colette, who was born in 1873, so they overlapped for 3 years, and died in 1954, before finally arriving at a multiplicity of names starting right at mid-century in France. Simone de Beauvoir, Marguerite Duras, Nathalie Sarraute. Nathalie Sarraute actually wrote her first book, which I think was Tropisme, in 1939. But of course, in 1939, people had other things on their minds, so she didn't become a really prominent writer until the second half of the century, until after 1950, until after the Second World War. During the Sand-Colette era, there were many other women writers, but a sharp distinction was drawn between women authors and actual authors. Sand and Colette were the exceptions to this rule. They alone were regarded as transcending the degraded category of femmes auteurs to become loftily auteurs. A long tradition in France held women to be incapable of writing in any vein other than the romantic, that is to say, to write about anything other than themselves, to traffic in ideas rather than feelings, or to appeal to the intelligence rather than to pure sentiment. The relative popularity of women writers in the early years of the 20th century was thus taken to be bad for the intellectual and spiritual health of the nation at large. And there were a number of anti-romanticism screeds. Charles Maurras, 1905, essay reprinted many, many times called Le Romantisme Féminin, and then Julien Banda's 1918 book, Belphégor. These were warnings that if French literature didn't become more virile, that hell in a handbasket was going to ensue. And therefore, women authors who were kind of carriers of this romanticism were dangerous. Colette seems to have been the first woman author to have surmounted this general indictment, but she did not manage fully to do so until 1920 with the publication of Chérie, because that was not based on her own life. The distinction between women writers and actual auteurs, actual authors, is still visible in a letter written by Simone de Beauvoir while she was in the process of writing The Second Sex, which was published in 1949, a book which would prove pivotal in the arduous and still ongoing process of dissolution of this very hierarchy between authors and women authors. In March 1948, Beauvoir, who was 30 at the time and not yet well known as an author in her own right, met the elderly Colette and wrote a gushing letter in approximate English about the encounter to Nelson Algren, the Chicago writer who was her lover at the time. She introduces the subject as follows. I quote from Beauvoir's letter, which was written in English. "I think you heard of Colette. She is the only really great woman writer in France. A really great writer." Close quote. The self-correction in this sentence makes it clear that a really great woman writer is not the same thing as a really great writer. Colette, Beauvoir wants to emphasize, has managed to be both. Some 15 years later, in La Force des Choses, published in 1963, the third volume of her memoirs, Beauvoir would paint a very different picture of this meeting, retrospectively transforming Colette into a somewhat monstrous old thing. But when writing to Algren immediately after the event, she is clearly thrilled. Having established the older woman's identity, she goes on in the 1948 letter to Nelson Algren. So she says, "I think you heard of Colette. She's the only really great woman writer in France, a really great writer," as I quoted before. And here she goes on. She says, she writes to Algren, "She was once the most beautiful woman. She danced in music halls, slept with a lot of men, wrote pornographic novels, and then good novels. She loved country, flowers, beasts, and making love. And then she loved, too, the most sophisticated life. She slept with women, too. She was fond of food and wine. Well, she loved all good living things, and she spoke beautifully about them. Now she is 75 years old and still has the most fascinating eyes and a nice triangular cat face. She is very fat, impotent by impotent, she means she can't walk, a little deaf, but she can tell stories and smile and laugh in such a way nobody would think of looking at younger, finer women." meaning herself, presumably, I guess. She then adds, so she spent an evening with her and a number of other people. She then adds, I hope I shall see her again. I was in love with her through her books when I was a girl, so it meant something to me to see her. So that's close quote. In her 1963 account of this same meeting, Beauvoir was more jaded about both the person and her works, noting that she'd been fascinated by Colette as a young girl, like everyone else, she adds, took pleasure in her use of language and enjoyed 3 or 4 of her books. She also describes her as having been cold and contemptuous toward her guest out of a general dislike of younger women, among other unpleasant characteristics, in a generally repellent portrait of the artist as a narcissistic old hag. In this memoir, Beauvoir also fails to mention what is evident to anyone who reads The Second Sex, which is that Colette's works are the key literary references for her discussions of female experience in the book that established Beauvoir's reputation as a pioneer of feminism. The work is filled with references to and quotations from Colette's writing, far more than from any other writer, with 35 references, than any other woman writer in any case, with 35 references discussing 15 separate works. So, I mean, in one half of the book, she talks about male writers, but in the other half of the book, about women's lives, she quotes Colette far more than. So again, 35 references discussing 15 separate works. The reason for her disproportional presence in Beauvoir's foundational work of modern feminism is clear, as she emphasized in her letter to Algren, but seems to have forgotten by the time she was writing her memoir. Colette was both the only really great woman writer in France and a really great writer. Her work is both, to quote her letter to Algren, her work is both great and all about female experience. In 1948, this was still essentially a contradiction in terms. It was also what Beauvoir was aiming at herself. Colette had a lot in common with her predecessor, Georges Sand. They were both women who wrote about female experience and yet managed to make it into the category of auteur rather than femmes auteurs. As a result, both were viewed as at once excessively and at once, or alternatively, excessively and insufficiently feminine. In the 19th century especially, women writers were seen as essentially hermaphroditic, since genius was a male attribute. Or a masculine attribute anyway. Charles Baudelaire, for instance, who appreciated the romantic poetess Marceline Desbordes-Valmore, poetry being a more feminine pursuit and Desbordes-Valmore a more traditionally feminine figure, Baudelaire nonetheless greatly disliked Sand and reserved his most damning epithet for her as an author, calling her La Femme Sand. That's the woman Sand. This was a terrible, terrible thing to say, apparently. This way, he also called her a lot of other things, but that was his favorite epithet, La Femme Sand. Flaubert, however, entertained an unlikely friendship with Sand, calling her cher maître. So calling her cher maître does not have an equivalent in English, but it's what you call your revered model, the masculine, and its masculine betokening utmost respect. He had earlier expressed the same contempt for her romantic novels as his contemporary Baudelaire, until she wrote him a fan letter after reading Madame Bovary, at which point he decided that she was, after all, quite perspicacious. They then met and became friends, and their correspondence makes a great read. I would definitely, from reading Sand's actual novels, you wouldn't get the impression that she had a great sense of humor, but in fact she does. Her correspondence with Flaubert is great. So Colette, too, was dismissed by many of her male contemporaries, although not with the same force of venom as Sand. In Colette's case, unlike that of her predecessor, almost all of them ended up hailing her as a great writer. Both Sand and Colette took on pen names. Sand's was forthrightly masculine, the last name a gesture toward her lover and sometimes collaborator, Jules Sandow. Colette's was deceptively feminine, even though, again, it was her father's name. They were both from the provinces. Each started out writing in collaboration with a man, and they both ended up vastly surpassing the fame of the man in question. Even though Sandow ended up in the Académie Française, he's not a household word now in France as she is. They both had notoriously, Sand and Colette, they both had notoriously tumultuous periods In both cases, with many lovers, male and female. Sand's lovers included among the best known Frédéric Chopin and the poet Alfred de Musset, as well as the actress Marie Dorval. Both were known for cross-dressing in public during their youthful, tumultuous periods. They both led lives that were as interesting to the public as their works and which helped publicize the latter. They both became baronesses by marriage, following which both divorced. They were both highly prolific authors who wrote to make a living. In L'Étoile Vespère, one of her last works, Colette briefly pays homage to Sand, calling her that robust working woman of letters. Cette robuste travailleuse, I think, de lettres. After all, they each pulled off, above all, they each pulled off a difficult feat, which in both cases seems to have been key to their enduring success. Both managed to be sexy in their youth and then eventually to make improbably seamless transitions to end up as venerable, that is to say, sexless, old monuments. Colette's life, like Sand, has inspired a number of films. The two most prominent Sand movies concentrate on her love affairs with famous men. Impromptu, from 1991, stars Judy Davis as Sand with Hugh Grant as Chopin, and Les Enfants du Siècle, made by Diane Curis in 1999, features Juliette Binoche as Sand and Benoît Magimel as Alfred de Musset. Colette's novels have been turned into innumerable films. She herself worked on a number of them, and then they've also been endlessly recycled for TV movies in France. And she appeared in a short, very staged documentary about her life at the end of her life in 1950. Her life has been dramatized in 2 French television biopics, as well as the aforementioned Becoming Colette. This was an international production which was also released in French as Devenir Colette in the early 90s. And of course, there was, how many people here saw the Keira Knightley Colette film? Okay, good. It's an interesting film. So these films, the one, not that one, but actually that one a little bit too. So they pretty much all pay homage to her idyllic provincial childhood and dwell at length on her relationship with Willy. The Sand biopics show her scribbling away, of course. Films about writers, as I mentioned on Monday, must always contend with the essentially uncinematographic or even anti-cinematographic spectacle of a person sitting in a chair writing, or else in Proust's case, propped up in bed writing. Perhaps ironically, given that Sand set out to be a writer, whereas Colette was pushed into her vocation, which she always insisted was not a vocation at all, not a calling, but rather a way to pay the rent. Writing, in the sense of the coming to writing or story of how she became a writer, is much more central to Colette's story as, well, of course, it makes sense, because in Sand intended it, therefore she then did it, whereas with Colette it was an unlikely story. As presented, it's much more central to Colette's story than to Sand's story in these film versions. This is because the crucial event in the narrative of Colette's life is the unlikely way she ended up a writer. I mean, the crucial event for the purposes of making a film, and that's also true of the Keira Knightley, the Wash Westmoreland version of 1918. That would be 2018. Her life was full of spectacular moments. The Moulin Rouge scandal of 1907, in which opens one of these films and is lengthily depicted in the recent film, in which she played a mummy brought to life by the kiss of an attentive Egyptologist, played by Missy. Her breast bearing in La Chair, which is also in the Keira Knightley version. Her trip to the front disguised as a man to visit her second husband at Verdun in the midst of World War I, to name only a few of the most dramatic. Each of these features in at least one of the films. But the Willy interlude, which brought the provincial childhood, oh no, there's that word again, idle, to an IDYLL, to an end, and propelled her into both writing and the world, is central to all of them. This is partly because Willy is a fascinating character in his own right, and because Colette tells the story herself in her memoir, Mes Apprentissages, concluding with, and that's how I became a writer. The episode is crucial to her story because she became famous by writing a book signed by someone else, and also because of her own insistence on the idea that she would never have become a writer if it had not been for Willy pushing her into it. The first three Colette biopics play fast and loose with her story. Of course, all cinematic adaptations, whether of novels or real-life events, must by necessity distort, compress, and truncate their stories. It's obviously impossible to remain entirely faithful to any narrative that exceeds the bounds of the 2 hours or so. In fact, two of these TV movies are 4 hours long in 2 parts, beyond which an audience's attention tends to stray. And I hasten to say, lest your attention tend to stray, that I'm coming to my conclusion here. When decades of a life are being represented in this sort of format, all that can be shown are representative episodes, and those episodes can only be more or less distorted, dramatized versions of the original story, which is itself necessarily only one possible version of the events in question. But these film adaptations of Colette's life don't just recount partial accounts. They also, almost without exception, import elements from her fiction into her life story. It's certainly not the first or only time material from a writer's fiction has seeped into biographical accounts. This often happens, especially with authors who themselves tend to blur lines between literature and life. Proust is a salient example. He was obviously asking for it when he wrote a semi-autobiographical novel of which the protagonist resembles but is not him, unlike the half-Jewish homosexual author, to name perhaps the most momentous difference, which I will be talking about on Friday. The hero of In Search of Lost Time is a heterosexual Gentile. So again, that'll be what I'm talking about on Friday. For readers and critics, to call the nameless narrator Marcel and confuse him with his author is perhaps inevitable. Generations of commentators have devoted their attention to figuring out which real-life figures are the originals of various characters, and George Painter, author of a long-standard Proust biography written in the 50s, went so far as to take the novel as a disguised autobiography and analyze it in the light of a version of the author's life that he had largely extrapolated from its pages, which is crazy. And also it was the standard biography in both English and in French up until the 90s, in fact. So I'll be talking about that on Friday. Colette's life and work are similarly interlinked to a certain extent, and yet her life, unlike Proust, is interesting in itself. Proust's ambition was to become a great writer, and following a period in the 1890s as a salon rat, during which he frequented some of the same salons as Colette, who included a nasty little cameo, a portrait of the future artist as a pretentious, feckless young man in Claudine en Ménage, her third book. Or Willy's third Claudine book, her third Willy-authored Claudine book. He spent most of his time in bed writing. Biographies of Colette, of which there have been many, concentrate on her life, which is, after all, what a biography is for, and tend to read her works as accessory commentaries on it. A book about Proust which attempted this would be both short and boring. His biographers tend necessarily to do the opposite. If he hadn't managed finally to get down to work and write his great novel, which is, among other things, a 3,000-page account of writer's block, his life would be worth recounting only as a remarkable example of neurasthenic inertia. The main reason anyone is interested in his life is for the backstory of the work, or else as a substitute for reading it. But reading a Proust biography instead of reading Proust is like reading Mastering the Art of French Cooking instead of cooking, or indeed eating. Nonetheless, people do that, but I mean, not mastering the, well, they probably do that too, actually. I don't know. Colette is a different matter. Her life was eventful and fascinating, and her works tend to be underrated. Most biographies, both book and film, stress her modernity, her proto- or crypto-feminism, the remarkable sexual freedom she displayed, and even at times flaunted, and her astonishing capacity for self-invention. The value of the work itself tends to get lost in all of this, and one of the ways the biopics unwittingly minimize the importance of her writing is by assimilating elements from her novels back into her fiction, back into her life. And I have to say, the recent version didn't do this so much. It did something else, and I'm just going to go describe these other films briefly, and then just say a few words about that last version. Above all, Colette is depicted in film versions of her life as embodying female freedom. The 2003 biopic made by Nadine Trintignant in 2003 is called Colette, une femme libre, a free woman. She and Georges Sand are Colette and Georges Sand are the perennial incarnations of womanly liberty in France. Gérard Poitou-Weber, whose 1999 film is entitled simply Colette, went on to make a Sand biopic called Georges Sand, une femme libre. Before Sand, you have to go back to the 17th century to find another such figure, to Ninon de l'Enclos, the brilliant, witty, aristocratic courtesan whose salon and bed were frequented for many decades by the best and brightest at the court of Louis XIV. There's also Germaine de Stael, but since she was sent into exile by Napoleon, she wasn't that libre. Those two are the most obvious contenders. Both the Colette televised biofilms, in the service of telling a complicated story in 2-hour installments, insert episodes from her fiction into her life. This move is reminiscent of George Painter reading Proust's fiction as autobiography with the names changed and recounting the author's life accordingly. But again, unlike Proust, Colette actually did things. In one version, for instance, the schoolmistress in Saint-Sauveur, her hometown, becomes Mademoiselle Sergent, the lubricious harridan schoolmistress from Claudine at School. The other one simply invents a young man based on the character Chéri so that Colette can base Chéri on him. It is not as though the life the life itself were insufficiently eventful. On the contrary, presumably filmmakers embroider on what is already an eventful life story, importing elements from fiction into biography in order to appeal to audiences familiar with her works and looking for neat correspondences with the life. In any case, the fiction-to-life transpositions shoehorned into these essentially well-meaning films serve to reinforce the unfortunate and inaccurate impression that all Colette ever did was simply write down what happened to her. The real story is much more complex and interesting, and I don't really have time to go into it, but I'm just going to say a few words about the crazy 1991 film, Becoming Colette. It takes the basic ingredients of Colette's early career, Willy, bisexual tendencies, authorship, Belle Époque Paris, puts them into a blender, presses puree, and pours out softcore pornography with a feminist chaser. Softcore pornography may be an exaggeration, but the film certainly flirts with the genre. Willy is played by a suave Klaus Maria Brandauer, who doesn't at all resemble the historical Willy. Of course, Dominic West plays him, but at least he's a bit padded in the recent film. So I won't go through this whole thing, but they also, there are sort of softcore pornographic scenes with complicated lingerie and gauzy lighting, which make the film look like a Victoria's Secret catalog photo shoot gone awry in the imagination of a 14-year-old boy. While Pollard tentatively caresses Gabrielle, who has complained of a headache, we watch Willy sketch an anatomically unlikely lesbian porn scene as Pollard looks at him for cues as to when to make her move. Eventually, the two women have gauzy sex. Willy then waiting for his cue to enter the scene. The film then abruptly shifts gear into feminist inspirational parable. Gabrielle has had enough of being her husband's ghostwriter and humiliates him by dressing in a man's suit and crashing a meeting of the all-male literary society. Everyone has this huge patriarchal beard. To announce that she, not Willy, is the author of the Claudine books. This is, I think, right after the sex scene. And they have to believe her because it turns out that Willy doesn't even know the title of his own supposed new novel. Pollard suddenly appears to support her, as does a young man named Jean Chapeau, whom the filmmakers have invented in order, I suppose, to avoid the implication that the heroine has been a lesbian all along and will run off with Pollard now that she's finally become Colette, that is to say, gotten rid of Willy. Anyway, and there was one other crazy element in this film, which is that she starts writing in the first place. So teenage Gabrielle starts writing before she's met Willy, starts writing her Claudine journal in the third person, as in when she's just met Willy for the first time, she writes, "Today Claudine met the man of her dreams." Why does young Gabrielle keep her diary in the third person, inventing a character called Claudine? The filmmakers apparently don't mind that this makes her sound as though she had some sort of form of dissociative personality disorder. They seem to want to show that Gabrielle has been Colette, which here means Claudine, all along, and Willy is just a vehicle to get her to Paris and sexual experimentation and independence. These films, all in their various ways, except for the most recent one, display Colette's life as the same more or less explicitly feminist morality tale. She starts out as Gabrielle in the Garden of Eden, dreamily allows herself to be whisked away by the big bad wolf, discovers Paris, discovers bisexuality, though always coming back to men in the end, except in the last version, discovers that she's a writer, asserts herself as a writer through symbolically killing and replacing said wolf. She becomes, in short, Colette, une femme libre. They also, all along the way, all display a great deal of lingerie slowly removed. So my point in discussing them is that the admixture of elements from her fiction in these stories serves to normalize her life at the same time that it mythologizes it, and thus to remove or underplay what is in fact most interesting. What's most interesting, it seems to me, is her writing, and also the sheer strangeness of her story, including the strange relation between the life and the work, what happened to her experience in the alchemical process of transforming it into writing. The Colette who comes across in these films, the Colette retained and purveyed by popular culture, is an altogether less remarkable creature than either her actual biographical counterpart, insofar as it can be known, or her own self-reflections in her work. And so I'll just, I don't have a big conclusion here. I'm going to pick up a different version of this same rumination on Friday with Proust. But I would just like to conclude by saying that the last, if you've seen the most recent film, you'll know that in fact it doesn't correspond to what I've been describing. Instead, that last film gives us a Colette for 2018, that is to say, an LGBTQ Colette, and it distorts the story just as much by removing by making her into a, it basically does another version of what Judith Thurman's biography, to 1999 biography did, that is to say, make Colette into a precursor of modern feminism. This film makes Colette into a precursor of current LGBTQ activism, which is, I mean, there isn't anything. There are a variety of inaccurate parts in that film, but mainly it's another way of marshaling Colette to confirm, but in retrospective anticipation, our own concerns. And so what is missing is Colette on her own terms, basically. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to, if you have questions or comments, I'm going to bring the microphone around just so that they can be picked up on the recording. Yes.
Having heard your Monday talk, right, where so much of the emphasis was on the role of the author or the death of the author or the absence of the author or the irrelevance of the author, right, in 20th century literary theory, and then the history of attitudes toward the author, right, in both sort of theory and criticism and actual authorship, right, before that. It was interesting that your talk today focused almost exclusively on the biographical, right, in relation, right, to a certain amount, right, of Colette's actual writing, right? And I'm just sort of wondering, where does the literary critic, right, fit into this equation, right? Just given what you said on Monday, right, and given, right, the tendency towards disappearing the author, right, in the 20th century, right, literary criticism, right, how did that, what effect did that have on critical attitudes, right, and theoretical attitudes towards Colette's life, which is so interestingly intertwined, right, with her work?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I was going to say nothing. It had no effect because, in fact, because she's a woman author, because a lot of what she wrote was, the thing is that Proust also is, but except that he didn't really do anything. So, but with Colette, the focus has always been resolutely on her life, except, basically the sort of death of the author type formalist, structuralist, post-structuralist criticism. The main, as far as I can tell, the main effect of that in Colette criticism is that people started doing things like saying, well, I'm going to call the biographical Colette Colette, and then I'm going to call, because she has a lot of works where the protagonist, that look like autobiography, but they are in fact fictional, like La Naissance du Jour, right, Break of Day. So the protagonist narrator is called Colette. She seems to coincide with the biographical Colette, but in fact she doesn't. There are lots of, it's sort of autofiction, basically. It's 1928 autofiction. And so people commenting on this do things like say, I'm going to call the biographical Colette Colette, and then I'm going to call Colette in the work Colette in quotation marks. And basically this is a gesture, on the one hand, this is a gesture that says, I'm not a naive reader. I've read Roland Barthes, and I know that this is an authorial persona and not the author. It's also, as I actually read through an entire manuscript where Colette was in quotation marks, and the thing is it's an inadequate response, but on the other hand, it's an insoluble problem. What do you do with that? The thing is that what I have, after many years of working on Proust and then trying very hard to write a book about Colette, writing a book about Colette, tossing it out, and what you've just heard is part of a second attempt, more like a fifth attempt, but the thing is that she's much, much harder to write about than Proust, in part for this reason. So basically what you have is people making gestures that say, academics writing about Colette, making gestures like, I'm going to put quotation marks to show that I know that it's not the biographical Colette, but no one has come up with a good way to deal with this, and she is kind of criticism-proof, as far as I can tell. Which is fascinating. I think it's fascinating. Proust is like Joyce in the sense that Joyce somewhere says, I want to keep the critics busy for 100 years or 1,000 years or something like that. Proust was like, I want to keep the critics interested for 100 years. And so he gives us all we need. Colette is like, I don't want any of that criticism business. And she just slithers away. So people, the answer to that question is people haven't done a very good job of dealing with this in terms of academic commentary. In terms of non- or para-academic commentary, what you basically get is just the same thing over and over again, which is a basic conflation of the author and her work. And that's because she asks for it, because she makes it very difficult to uncouple them, and also because the last thing she wrote about Claudine is called The Mirror, I think. It's a short piece in which she is sitting and staring at Claudine. There's a dialogue between Colette and Claudine, and each is sort of accusing the other of having ruined her life. So she plays with so many of the, I don't know, basically. I don't know how to answer that. It's just impossible to. No one has found a good way to deal with this, including me.
Oh, this is a follow-up to that because it was such a great question and your answer was so great. But what
I
can
believe
we
my
do?
answer was, I don't know.
This, I know. But so I know you know a lot of the people in song studies, or I assume you know who I'm talking about. There's, basically a group, mostly women, not exclusively, but literary critics who work on Georges Sand. And the attention is paid to her biography as well as her works and the interrelations between those, highlighting things such as maternal feeling and this type of thing, as opposed to separating out her writing as completely distinct from her biography. So, but I'm not, since I'm not a 20th century person, I'm not really familiar with the literary critics who write about Colette, but I assume there are also well-known people who have devoted some or all of their academic time to writing about Colette, and I was wondering,
Not
I
really.
guess I'm asking you, can you characterize these critics? Are they a group, and what makes them function in the way that I very vaguely, and we can talk later maybe more about this, but kind of I see the song people as a group.
Yeah, they are.
And I don't know, is that one way to kind of answer this question? And what would you say about Colette people, if that's...
Well, first of all, the Sand people, the Sand people are Sandolators who will vigorously attack, whose lives seem to be, whose professional lives seem to be devoted to insisting that Sand is a great author like Balzac or Stendhal or Flaubert. And I think that's simply not true. So I don't get along very well. We don't really talk. I think that Sand's life is more interesting than her work, honestly. I find Sand not that readable. I just don't like her work. I love her correspondence with Flaubert. I think she's a fascinating character. I've actually visited Nohant, which is totally worth it, her house. She's fascinating, but I don't find her work fascinating per se. So I actually think that her work is fascinating in terms of her life, because I don't think her work is that fascinating in itself. Lots of people disagree with me vehemently, which is fine. Colette, though, I've been to a number of Colette. There was one really prominent person who devoted his life to, not exclusive, Claude Pichois, who wrote the definitive biography of Colette, who's now, who died sometime in the 90s, I believe. Or maybe, like 15 years ago. Now the thing about Pichois is that he did he wrote a huge biography, the definitive biography of Colette. He also wrote the definitive biography of Baudelaire. He edited he edited Colette in the Pléiade edition. He also edited Baudelaire and Nerval, I think, in the Pléiade edition. So I actually once asked him. He was very different from from the general run of Colette people, who are generally Colette auditors who have staked their careers on writing stuff about Colette. And I said, may I ask, Baudelaire and Nerval and Colette, that's a really weird set of people to have worked on. Could you explain? And he said, I think Colette is a really great writer. And so after I finished my, Baudelaire, Pléiade, and biography, I just wanted to work on her. And so, but most are not. He was a real anomaly. So that's, I don't know if I've really answered your question well, but.
I've been given the signal that I
Yeah,
have to
sorry, I
send-
think I went on a bit too
No,
long.
that's fine. I have to send you all out into the cold. I'm sorry about that. I tried to arrange different weather, but couldn't really manage it. But please join us again on Friday when Proust will be the subject. And before you brave the elements, please thank our speaker again.